exist. As the proverb says, tomorrow never comes. There is no such thing as tomorrow. There never will be, because time is always now.
Welcome to the Philosophical Minds Podcast, the podcast about the stuff we wonder about.
And other things.
All right, we are here with the Pandemanian drug lord, Jay Dyer. Just kidding. We're here with Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis. He is an author, investigative analyst, and podcaster. He goes deep into the darkness, into the realms of psychological warfare, culture, and geopolitical nature of things. I like to give credit where it's due. I recently listened to an interview you did on the TFH podcast with Sam Tripley and XG and those guys over there. Really enjoyed listening to you break things down so nicely. And since then, I've listened to a number of your podcasts, and I just love the presentation and the documentation-based approach, as well as some quite hilarious impersonations that you do. Get some good Bill Clinton and McKenna in there.
Yeah, we do quite a bit of weird stuff for sure.
Yeah, you got that Theo Von-esque type flavor you add in there every now and then.
A little bit, yeah. Well, being from Tennessee, yeah. So
right. And
it comes natural.
Okay, can you guys hear me okay?
Sounds good so far. Yep.
So I am someone who I love the occult, and what I mean by that, it is like the hidden or the esoteric, metaphysical, multidimensional or lesser seen aspects of reality. So when I say I love the occult, I want to make it clear. I'm not saying I'm an aspiring dark arts black magician. People get this misconstrued. I'm not into black magic or satanic ritual abuse or psychological manipulation, hoarding power, or asserting any form of dominance or harm. In fact, I'm kind of in opposition to those things. But as you know, Jay, there are many who are into that shit, and that's kind of right up your analytical alley. And yeah, I think it's beneficial to know what's out there so that we can be more aware individuals and, just know what to avoid, or at least we can proceed with caution. And me personally, I'm kind of more focused on like the hidden history of medicine and alchemy and all that. But I do love to investigate from time to time the more spooky aspects of reality, because they're very much so, they do exist. And that's why I love your work. And it really resonates with me because you go into those areas and you expose that there are many individuals out there who indeed are on that dark side of the coin. And you draw awareness to that. And you do a beautiful job illuminating, really going like into some of these realms and many of the sinister aspects and psyops or illusions that play out on the world stage and really shape culture. And thank God we live in a day and age where we can kind of get away with speaking truth to power, at least on some level. So yeah, I really appreciate the work you do. And before we get into it, before we get into all that, I just want to kind of ask you, like, what got you interested in all this stuff in the first place?
I remember I grew up with a mom that encouraged me to read a lot. So she was an editor. So I read a lot of books growing up, and then she became a librarian after that. So there's always a lot of reading and just all kinds of different topics. And so that was a huge plus. And then by the time I got into high school, I got really into Hollywood. So I wanted to be an actor. I wanted to do all that kind of stuff. And so I always loved movies. And then by the time of college, I got into philosophy and psychological warfare and all these other topics. So really, I just wanted to kind of tie everything together when I was doing grad work. And that led me to looking at overlaps in these different fields. And that got me looking at how Hollywood has for a long time been deeply connected to both cults and people who worked in intelligence. So that was a big part of it. And then separate from that, I got kind of deeper into, geopolitics, as you mentioned, and kind of, 20th century warfare, what happened in the 20th century with the power blocks, the big power structures. And then that kind of got me into the other fields of looking at even things like economics and how that relates to geopolitics, banking, and all that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, it was just kind of going, further and further down the rabbit hole. And then, just branching out and noticing connections. So all of these areas are definitely connected. And one thing I will say about philosophies like alchemy or Hermeticism is that typically they derive from philosophies like Neoplatonism, that there's always some kind of branch from Neoplatonism from which they come. And most of the time that's an attempt to categorize all reality, to make sense of things on a big scale, a meta level scale. And so that's most of the time what I'm interested in doing. So hence why I do at least appreciate the attempt of disciplines like alchemy and stuff like that to see how everything relates.
Definitely. Yeah, you definitely go deep into, you have many podcasts with all different kinds of debates and the theologies and all that.
Yeah,
stuff.
We've been at it for a long time. So yeah, it's been I think I started doing this stuff full time about 5 years ago. And then I'd already just kind of been doing it on the side for another 6 or 7 years before that. So yeah, we've been pumping out content for, about 12 years. So there's definitely a long back catalog of stuff to get into. But yeah, the more you do it, the longer you do it, the more you see how much things actually interconnect. So even some of those older podcasts relating to Neoplatonism, alchemy, that kind of stuff, it's still relevant, 10, 12 years later, looking at stuff I'm looking at now, like getting into serial killers and organized crime. You might not think there's a connection there, but quite a few serial killers and people who, were involved in that kind of stuff have pretty significant connections to things like organized crime and cults.
Definitely. Yeah, I love it. We can really go anywhere. I want to touch on, intelligence agencies, think tanks, mafia families, as you've covered them so well. At first, I'd really like to touch on what I think are like the major mechanisms behind the dark curtain. That'd be things like psychological warfare, social engineering, and like behavioral modification. I think if people can understand these things and how they've been used and are being used and will continue to be used for mass manipulation,
Right.
I think that'd be really great to kind of like arm people with that knowledge. And before we get into everything, some of these programs and the subject matters, I kind of want to preface this, since I'm some of this may have to do with like psychedelic drugs being used for strategic and sinister means. I want to make my position known that I'm not necessarily against many of these drugs themselves. It's more about how they're being used. I'm one of those guys who ultimately I'm all about individual freedom. And, if an individual has a fully developed prefrontal cortex and you're an adult, I'm like, do what you want as long as you're not causing harm or infringing on the rights of anyone else. If someone wants to, take a substance to alter their reality, I say that's for them to ultimately discern for themselves whether or not I would. Lots of people say nice things about LSD. I personally just don't vibe with that. I don't have any desire or feel drawn to that at all. But hey, other things like, cannabis, I have nothing but positive things to say about it. Those are my experiences, and my experience is my own. And I definitely, I recommend people doing in-depth research on any substance, that they put into their body, and just be aware, and it's not always positive for everyone. There's a ton of bad experiences that people have had, and I'm all about knowing what you're putting into your body and how things affect you. And with that being said, on that note, some people out there are just all for these experimental vaccines, and I respect their opinions and decisions if that's what they want to do. I say do you. I personally am not down, like straight up. I'm like, stay the fuck away from me with that needle. On top of that, I've zero respect for these manufacturers of these vaccines and the politicians pushing them on people, and like the World Health Organization and their alleged science. And I'm for the most part like a pretty chill guy, but when I hear any potentially, like any potentiality of any form of mandatory vaccination being even contemplated, I just get passionately angry. And I just hope and pray that people see the danger and disgust in this notion of even entertaining the idea of a mandatory vaccine as something that would in any way, shape, or form
Right.
be the right thing to do or ethically like a sound move for society. And
Right.
so I just want to kind of get your thoughts. Like, I'm going to open it up to you and like anything about that. And then who's this Bertrand Russell guy, and how does he tie into all of this as well?
Yeah, I agree with, I mean, I've done quite a few critiques of people that kind of set the stage for that with medical tyranny and people that were kind of working in the background to promote that ideology that humans are more or less just cattle to be experimented on. I think that's ridiculous. It's very, very dangerous. It's even illegal. I mean, that's part of the Nuremberg Code. So yeah, I would definitely not be for anything like that. I pretty much have a keto, carnivore, organic lifestyle that I've held to for at least, I don't know, several years. So yeah, I definitely don't think people should have anything like that happen to them. It's totally preposterous. But the mindset, the worldview that would do that is a worldview that's based around things like materialism, Darwinism, social Darwinism, even darker philosophies like Luciferianism, satanic philosophies, etc. So that's where I think we have to look to understand the mindset of people who push this stuff. Is, you mentioned Bertrand Russell. Well, he's a preeminent example of an atheist who was rabidly committed to things like depopulation, drastically reducing the human population, doing this via a global technocratic tyrannical government that would be set up in the next century. That was their plan that they had sketched out even 100 years ago. People like H.G. Wells, people like Aldous Huxley, people like Bertrand Russell, Lord Birkenhead, who wrote a famous essay even before Huxley did in Cosmopolitan magazine back in the teens, 20s, teens or 20s. And he was saying even before Huxley that we'll have a technocratic government, babies will be born in test tubes, you won't have any rights, everything will be surveilled. So this is, again, a known 100+ year plan, and it goes back even further to bring in a technocracy. So when you go and you read these guys, they sketch all that out clear as day. So it's not even a hidden conspiracy. Even H.G. Wells wrote a book called The Open Conspiracy, and he said that we're confident enough in our plan that it doesn't have to be secret. It can be public, it can be open. H.G. Wells was a famous Freemason, a famous Marxist and socialist, and he was confident that capitalism would be the vehicle to build the system. And then when the system was built by capitalism, the socialists could just take it over, and it would be run by this pyramid, right, with the technocratic elite at the top of the pyramid. So really, it's not so much about systems like communism or socialism. They have a part to play, but in the end, it's a Luciferian system. H.G. Wells has another book called God, the Invisible King. And the God he's talking about is not the kind of God that we typically think of. It's a God that's a secret God, a hidden God. And most of the secret societies would also speak of this kind of a secret God or a hidden God. Ultimately, I think it's a kind of a Luciferian system. Although H.G. Wells more or less says Lucifer in that book, if I recall. It's been some years since we covered that, maybe a year ago. But regardless, the overall technocratic plan is the same. And one thing that I kind of focused on in the last 3 years was going through the writings of the elite themselves. So we've done almost, I think, 50 books that the elites have written over the last century. 2 Bertrand Russell books, multiple H.G. Wells books, at least 3 or 4, I think, H.G. Wells books, fiction and nonfiction. So a lot of people don't know that he didn't just do War of the Worlds, Island of Dr. Moreau, and this kind of stuff. He also did a lot of nonfiction books that were propaganda, and he was one of the preeminent, premier, probably the first great propagandist expert in psychological warfare. So to understand psychological warfare, even before Bernays, we have to understand the importance of H.G. Wells. And so H.G. Wells formulated everybody's thought processes on things as diverse as genetic engineering, the moon landing, atomic weapons in the time machine, all the way up to predicting World War II and the shape of things to come. Aliens comes from basically out of H.G. Wells. So all of these ideas that are so commonplace, in modernity, they really spring from H.G. Wells. And if you read modern propagandists and experts in psychological warfare, a lot of them will cite H.G. Wells as well. So that's where we have to understand the importance of what psychological warfare does, is that it gives us our narratives, it gives us our stories, our explanations. That's why Hollywood is such an important player in this. And so I would say, key figures would be somebody like H.G. Wells. Then we want to know and understand Bertrand Russell. I mean, not Bertrand Russell. I mean, he's important, but from the vantage point of psychological warfare, Edward Bernays is the next important, right? Because he's going to try to, he's the relative of Freud, and he's going to take Freudian insights and principles and apply it to advertising. He works for the Department of Defense. He renames it the Department of War to Department of Defense. He takes a lot of the insights from people like H.G. Wells, and he takes it to the next level. So a lot of wartime intelligence and strategies go into psychological warfare for domestic use. And so guys that were OSS, that were doing military intelligence during World War II, they would actually go on to be the heads of the major studios like CBS, ABC, right? William Paloff, or Sarnoff, Paley, and there's a couple other people, that multiple people in Hollywood were in the OSS. So the point is that a lot of people don't realize how much Madison Avenue and advertising is actually affected by psychological warfare. Because if you think about it, it makes perfect sense, right? Because the techniques and the strategies that you're using in wartime to convince the enemy, right, to give up, to accept your position, to defeat his morale, to sell the position, right? It's going to be used in advertising. It's going to be used in all these different fields. So what happens then after the Bernays phase is that gets really studied on a scientific level. Insights from, Pavlov, all those kinds of figures, J.B. Watson, all these psychologists gets imported into the field as well. And so really, I think the think tanks then kind of take over this role of being the primary steering committees for culture and for the decisions of the shadow government for the elite. And so that's who makes these decisions and who drives, the plan and the program. And that's why we see the program consistent across different countries, right? I mean, it's not 100%, but you don't see, Australia implementing a plan different from the US, right? Look at what happened in 2020, right? The whole world adopted the exact same program because most of the countries in the world are under the influence of this kind of power structure. And so that was a long-winded explanation of how psychological warfare is basically the tool that's used out of wartime intelligence that's kind of been adapted and modified for domestic social engineering, nudging. Cass Sunstein, the famous, cognitive infiltrator theorist, said that we would just nudge the public with all these different things. So that's how it works. They've perfected the techniques to use basically everything in culture to steer the mind of man.
And it just seems right now more than ever, I mean, it just seems so obvious. And it, like, with all this stuff, especially that's coming to fruition with things that they've discussed themselves in all these books and in audio recordings. And I mean, even say hypothetically they had a legit vaccine that worked great. Aside from that, it's like this blind allegiance to these technocratic assholes trying to impose this on the masses, and how they just have such influence. These guys like Fauci or Gates, and wear 2 masks, take 2 vaccines, and I don't know. I was just somewhere the other day. I think it was one of these outside gas stations. They had like one of those outside TVs, and they were playing a clip on the news and the guy's like some hype man for these clinics or something, and he goes, look, the important thing is that you just get a vaccine. Don't worry about deciding between which one, Moderna, Pfizer, J&J. Important thing is you just go out and you get a vaccine. And it's like this sheep mentality of don't question anything, just trust your authorities. They know what's best. Anyway, so you had mentioned this Luciferianism. I was just wondering, can you kind of go over like what is the general ideology of Luciferianism?
So I think the idea here is that Satan or Lucifer, I think they're the same being. They could be either real or just representative of human reasoning, basically attaining to godhood. So that's kind of the undergirding philosophy here. You could look at somebody like Michael Aquino, who was the Army's, he basically set the Army's modern doctrine of psychological warfare. If you read his famous essay from Mind War to from Psy-War to Mind War. And that essay is really important for demonstrating that the techniques and the strategies that they had developed, even to the point of electronic warfare, really sophisticated frequency manipulation, all that kind of stuff could be directed at the population. And if you know Michael Aquino's attitude, I mean, that makes perfect sense. I mean, he was very much a Luciferian. He was very much a social Darwinist. So he believed that it actually should happen. He thought that he could actually invoke the end times, the end of the world. So he's a great example of somebody who got, pretty high level. He became a general. Again, he set the Army's psychological warfare doctrine with that essay and other works. So in his case, it seemed to be pretty openly like advocating wickedness. I mean, he was implicated in some pretty serious child abuse situations and the Presidio scandal. There's allegations of connections to the Franklin cover-up. So that's one example of what Luciferianism is as a representative from inside, the shadow government, so to speak. And other people he was connected to had similar philosophies as well, where they can import transhumanism into the system to, give the impression that, this is the future, that if you adopt this system, you can live forever. But at the same time, these people are not trustworthy. I mean, he's a person who is basically a doctorate in deception. That's what psychological warfare is. So it's amazing to me that people would trust these people in what they try to sell you. And yet they do. So that's what I mean. Luciferianism is just the attitude that man can be God. Man will become God. Most likely, technology will be the means by which man can become God. And whether it's Crowley or whether it's Anton LaVey or whether it's Michael Aquino, they all basically say that man will storm heaven, dethrone God, and become God through technology.
And also, I wanted to point out, I listened to the recent episode you did with Tripoli and Callan, which was amazing, by the way. And I think he was talking about the founding fathers kind of warning against totalitarianism and, citing like Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, etc. And maybe to some degree that's true, yes. But at the same time, I don't think they were all so saintly. And I don't know, I would defer to like the Federalist Papers. What was it actually? Federalist Paper number 10 or something. We talk about this kind of with this divide and conquer mentality of putting the rich against the poor and something along those lines. Do you remember that, Ashley?
Yeah, Federalist Papers, this goes back because this was pre-law school, so it was political ideologies. We had a phenomenal professor, and she went through all the ideologies, and we studied the Federalist Papers. And in Federalist Paper number 10, it was written by Madison, I believe. And that specific one, it talks about, separating the masses into factions. And it talks about, the way that you can control the majority, and the way that it describes the majority is, people who are actually what we deem as the minority now. The minority in the Federalist Papers referred to the rich and the wealthy. So the majority was, the poor, lower class, middle class, And they talk about the best way to keep these groups from organizing together is to pit them against each other with their differences. And so if these groups are fighting amongst each other, they can never unite to basically rise up against the minority, which would be the wealthy. And it's just a really interesting collection of letters, because these were drafted, during the time that they were contemplating, what would be in the Constitution. And there's a response, letters from Brutus, and it's a pseudonym. They don't know, who wrote that specific section. I think they speculate it was possibly Jay. But anyhow, so I don't know if you've read that, but this is not something that's new. This has been going on for centuries. So.
Right. Well, yeah, and divide and conquer is the old imperial strategy, right? So this is mentioned in Caesar's diaries and whatnot, and it goes all the way back to the ancient world. They had pretty sophisticated tricks and tactics for these kinds of things. You can read Art of War. You can read Machiavelli has a book called Art of War that a lot of people aren't familiar with, where he talks about all these different tricks and strategies in book 6 of his Art of War. So yes, and I think that with the founding fathers, you have a mix of people and ideologies, and that's typically what we find in the Renaissance, the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is a mix of ideologies actually coming out of Renaissance. But so there's on the one hand, there's Mosaic law, biblical law, common law, natural law. Italian Republic influences them. Plato. There's a confluence of influences, including Freemasonry. Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke, directly on Declaration of Independence. So if you know the Enlightenment, you know their philosophy, then you can see why, as is the case with most philosophy, philosophers are typically good and bad at the same time. And so there's good and bad in that system. And I'm not trying to be vague here, but there's definitely pros and cons in the American experiment, the American idea. My critiques of America and the Enlightenment would probably be more of a classical traditionalist perspective. So I'm not a huge fan of the Enlightenment. I don't think it was as great a thing as most people think, but there are definitely some pros to it. So I do think we should have rule of law and these kinds of things, but no, you're not going to get basically I've done a lot of critiques of the Enlightenment. I'll boil it down to it's based around the idea of the exaltation of reason. So the success of the Enlightenment and it's how correct it is only correct insofar as their position given to human reasoning is. So if you don't believe human reasoning is ultimate, then you're not going to be a huge fan of the Enlightenment. So that's the root problem here. I come from a religious philosophy, so I don't see the Enlightenment as the greatest of all, experiments.
With the Enlightenment, I have a question for you, because this is something that I've talked about with colleagues for a lot of conversations, just because it's interesting to me, the irony. I also come from kind of a religious background, so that shapes and molds how I view things, and kind of when I'm studying something intellectually, I relate it back that way. But with the Enlightenment, I find it odd that we talk about how it brought us out of this era where you were born into your position, right? And the Enlightenment, you're supposed to be able to work towards whatever profession or skill that you're talented in, or that you appear to have somewhat success in. It's still, so we sit there and sell this idea that, you can accomplish anything, and, the sky's the limit, especially in America. But we still have a system set up that, based upon what dirt of, the land space that you're born in, that's going to limit or expand what your opportunities are. For instance, if you're born, in a third world country where we don't have a visa waiver program, you have to apply to actually be able to visit the United States. I studied abroad, and I was speaking with one of the guys from Brazil, and he was telling me how he couldn't get a visa to just come travel to the US. And so I think it's odd because we say how we've come so far from that, but in reality, I think that we still have those social systems set up to kind of keep people in this status quo. You know,
Well, I
what
mean,
do you
look at the
think?
tax system. I mean, the tax system is set up so that you don't really have upward mobility. So
Right.
it's very difficult. So yeah, I think a lot of the Enlightenment platitudes were really just kind of a selling point. I mean, to a degree that it did accomplish certain things, I suppose. I mean, I don't doubt that there, you know, surely, yeah, there was tyranny under the, you know, feudal system, obviously. Uh, but I think there's actually pros to monarchy, believe it or not. If you read somebody like Hans Hermann Hoppe, he makes good points about this. So I just don't think that the idea that we're going to achieve, anytime somebody's trying to sell you on fairness, you know, the irony is that today's woke crowd is just really the latest instantiation of what previous generations back to the Enlightenment were selling as fairness. So it's only as good as the system itself. So is it true that everybody is universally equal? No, it's not true. So the attempt to force everybody into a system of universal equality, which is an Enlightenment idea in its principle, is destructive and not actually advantageous to everyone. Because some people are better than other people. Some people are extremely talented. Some people can do things. And so the irony is that the Enlightenment's selling point of equalizing the field so that people can have upward mobility actually morphs into an attempt to cut everybody off to make everybody enforced in equality, and thus it's self-destructive. So it's and the reason for that is because it's just another materialistic system. So it doesn't matter whether it's Marxism and socialism or whether it's monopolistic capitalism. All of those systems have the same presupposition of materialism. But if materialism isn't true, then it doesn't, none of those systems that you adopt is really going to matter. You're going to have the same tyranny in just in different ways, right? So do you want the Soviet tyranny where everybody's in bread lines, or do you want the capitalist tyranny where you've got Coke and Pepsi and you're forced to get vaccines to have a job? I mean, both of these systems are atheistic. They're both materialistic. They're both dangerous. And they're just equally satanic. And the irony is that people like H.G. Wells wrote books saying, even Marx said that there's nothing wrong with capitalism. It's not a thing to fight. It's just a stage that will lead to the next stage, right? And so H.G. Wells said to his fellow Marxists and socialists, he said, there's no point in fighting capitalists. He says, just let them build the global infrastructure for the global government, and then we'll take it over.
Right, exactly. I think it was Jefferson that said there should be a revolution every 20 years or every generation.
Right, and he even wrote about it needed to be bloody. So
Right.
Jefferson is an example of a person who is I think Luciferian. I think he was Luciferian in the fact that he saw the advantage of the Jacobin system as well as the Girondin system that was influencing the American revolutionaries. So he didn't care whether it was communist, socialist, whatever. I mean, revolutions are good just because they're revolutions. And so he had that view of the deification of man's reasoning. But again, there's no, if atheism is true and we're going to deify human reason, then there's no reason to deify human reason, because there's no reason for anything, because everything just is, right? So you can't get truth, you can't get necessary conditions and something following from something else if everything is just matter, right? Because that's logic. And if you reduce logic to matter, that reductionism actually undercuts logic itself. So materialism, atheism, reductionism destroy logic and reasoning. And that's the irony of the Enlightenment, is that its atheist materialist presupposition is self-refuting to the Enlightenment itself. And all we've seen in the history of the West in the last 300-400 years is the proof of that argument. So why are we degenerating? Why are we because we have the Enlightenment presuppositions that we have.
Yeah, and it seems history tends to repeat itself as well. You know, no matter how much we try to escape past things that we've done, you see it replicate over and over. Doesn't seem that we
right. But I'm just saying that I think ideas sometimes take centuries to ferment, to come to full fruition. So in philosophy, sometimes people call this epistemological self-consciousness. And all that means is that you can have an idea or a starting point in your system that doesn't come to full fruition until perhaps a few generations later, right? An example of this would be of the accuracy of the biblical text, right? So Luther starts what will become, roughly speaking, higher critical doubt of the text. Now, in Luther's day, he didn't really doubt the whole Bible, right? But within a few centuries, few generations, the German universities had completely deconstructed the Bible, basically said none of it's true, right? So that's an example of a beginning point with Luther. Within a few centuries, German universities completely destroyed belief in the Bible. So in the same way, systems have starting points, they have foundational axioms or whatever you want to say that kind of determine the rest of the worldview, the belief system. And it might take people 200, 300, 400, 500 years for that to work itself out as an idea within a people group, within a civilization. So, I mean, that's not something new to me. I mean, a lot of philosophers have talked about this point. Ideas have consequences. Sometimes it takes a while for that to work out. So America is an Enlightenment experiment. It's the culmination of centuries of revolutions. And the question is just, I'm just asking, well, why is this idea of perpetual revolution good or correct?
Would you say that an idea of an evolution is correct versus a revolution, in the sense that we would evolve as a society, and like you had mentioned, becoming too materialistic and atheistic about things? And I think also, if you go to the opposite extreme, if you're only too spiritualistic, I think that the ideal situation would be kind of a balance in that in-between realm. What would you say to that?
Well, I didn't mean materialistic in the sense of acquiring more possessions. I meant the philosophy of materialism, that reality is just fundamentally matter, right? So that's the predominant view of most atheists, most materialists, Sam Harris, Dawkins, all those kind of people, right? Most professors, right, would be atheistic materialists. I'm just saying that has consequences. It's self-refuting. It's destructive to the possibility of logic, of mathematics, etc. So, but words like evolution are very elastic. So it depends on what we mean by that word. I don't mean to be a Jordan Peterson here. Depends on what you mean. But literally in this case, yes, it depends on what we mean, because humans adapt to situations. So if evolution just means adapting to a situation, sure. But no, in the sense of Darwinian evolution, that's a grand narrative that tries to give an account for the origins of all life, the origin of species, etc. And it relies on these just fanciful fairy tale stories that cannot be empirically verified or justified. They're just dogma. I put a lot of time into studying this topic, so I'm always eager to critique it on a philosophical perspective. So I would not even like really using the word evolution, just because it's so it's kind of a loaded word that's packed with a lot of baggage. But no, I think, again, central to the global technocratic worldview is evolution. It's Darwinism. That's one of the dogmas of the technocratic system. And so they package and sell this to people as if technology is the next stage in evolution and you're going to live forever via technology. And it's just a scam. I mean, why does it take so much propaganda? Why is it a bunch of people who are known liars selling us this stuff? I mean, the same people telling you that you're going to live forever through technology, the same people telling you all this crap about the vaccines and the stabbies and the mRNA. So, I mean, if people don't believe them on that, why is anybody going to believe? I mean, DARPA is not your friend. They're not here to give you life extension. That's not for you. They're not going to give you that. I mean, look at how has the military treated its soldiers over the years? Do they have a good track record of treating soldiers well? No. So the belief that they're going to give this, to DARPA helps out soldiers that are in need, that have lost a leg, and they give them a biomechanical leg because they love the soldier. No, you're just an experiment, dude. You don't matter to the government. They don't care about you. Again, you read the people who write these things, they say they don't care about you. So they're not going to give you.
There always has to be a motive. I said there always has to be a motive, right? And primarily that motive is money or power or things that are going to, a politician is not in the game to just sit there and, not be noticed or not do, do all these good things without getting recognition. I mean, it's just the very essence of what their position is. It's very public. And, typically when they make decisions, they might have good morals that guide them, but when they're making those decisions, there's constantly conflicts of interest. So you'll have politicians who own shares in large companies. This is something that, I mean, since I first started practicing law, I do corporate law, and the boards of directors, most companies have politicians that are seated on those boards. And so if you think that a politician is going to make a decision on legislation and not consider the shares that they own in the companies where they get benefits if those companies do well, it's just insane. But I think that people, they don't see that side of that coin a lot of times. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're not wrong in that, but I'm speaking more so to what I think is the dominant power structure in the world, which is a more inner core of technocratic elites. And I think that they kind of have the say so even amongst the shareholders of the Fortune 100. So we're talking about, there was a study done a few years ago by, I don't know, Swedish technical analyst people. You can look it up. They did a whole TED talk on it, but they showed that there's a very small percentage of people that have controlling shares in the world's GDP. So there's a very small amount of people who can have a huge amount of power and influence via being shareholders in the top companies. And again, that's why we don't see actual competition at the highest level, right? I mean, again, the programs, the propaganda, the social engineering that the Fortune 100, 500 roll out, it's all the same. Why is that? Why is there not, I thought we're doing competition here. No, at those top levels, they all go to the same steering meetings. They all go to Bilderberg. They're all Trilateral Commission. They all go to the same Bohemian Grove, all the same stuff because they set the same policy, because they're part of the same plan. And it's not just then. I can go back 100 years to the same people with the same plan that's unrolling and unveiling before our eyes that people 100, 150 years wrote about. They said they would do this, and here it is, lo and behold, right? So if people can't figure out that there's an inner core, what Quigley and Orwell called the inner party, it's not the politicians, it's not people that are just greedy. This is a beyond just greed. This is an attempt to control all of reality and life, and it's an attempt to rewrite the entire biosphere. So Klaus Schwab, in his book, the last third of his new book is about that. He says we're going to rewrite the entire biosphere. And this is because the attitude is that nature's broken, we will fix it. The scientific priest class and elite will come along, and we will use man as a test subject to further evolution so that we can have immortality.
And it's every time it just comes down to psychological warfare, social engineering, and behavioral modification, in my opinion. And you talked a little bit about like the inner core people, and I'd love to kind of establish a little bit of a background, like historically with all your knowledge and research. What are some, you kind of touched a little bit on it, what are some of the major institutions like that are empowering specifically like these psychological warfare operatives? But can you get into some examples of like some of the operations?
Well, the Ivy League universities, typically, for example, we saw at the beginning of this outbreak of so-called COVID, Yale University put out studies saying that they needed to socially engineer the public to accept the narratives, right? So that's public, that came out. MIT was putting out information about how we got to condition the public to understand that we'll never go back to normal. This is a complete rewrite and change of the whole. So the big universities will churn out these people who will go into think tanks. They get recruited out of universities. It's not just Ivy League schools, but a lot of the Ivy League schools recruit these people. So, and then, you got the top think tanks would be things like Brookings Institute, would be Carnegie, would be Rockefeller Institute, Soros's Open Society Institute, Ford Foundation. Right? So these foundations are above even the intelligence level people. So people that are doing intelligence work, they might be in the field, they might be doing some kind of operation, they might be working in media, this kind of stuff. But the people at the think tanks and the foundations are a little bit above that because they will actually set policy for large swaths of society. And so they're the ones that go to these steering committee meetings. They go to these big, again, sort of committees, and they try to implement policy to a lot of different arenas. So a good example of this is the infographic that somebody made a year or so ago, where it was all the people it was just media, right? So the top media companies, all the top heads of the media companies, New York Times, all that stuff, right? Fox, et cetera. They go to the same trilateral commission meeting, and they all go to the same Bilderberg meeting. Easy, perfect example. It's all laid out in a perfect graphic for anybody to understand. And that's just media, okay? That's just one side of the global pyramid. There's also banking. There's also the Fortune 100, right? I mean, and yes, some of the media companies are part of the Fortune 100, but I mean, there's multiple other, super high level positions, as I'm sure you know from doing corporate law. I mean, think about the pharmaceutical companies. I mean, they have a huge amount. That's up near the top of the pyramid, right? They have a huge amount of power. Oil companies, right? They can start wars. So when we understand that it really is a global interconnected system, that the pyramid analogy is fitting. It's like a pyramid. I'm not saying there's one human person at the top, but it is a global system structured like a pyramid. And there are, hierarchies, there are these steering committees. And I do think up towards the top are some of the wealthiest and sort of old line families that have multi-generational wealth. And that's why you saw, for example, the Vatican meeting with Fortune 100 heads and the Rothschilds to work out what they call inclusive capitalism, to sell everybody on the green agenda, on revamping all of society, and the World Economic Forum's Klaus Schwab plan. So here's the Vatican, there's the World Economic Forum, Davos, there's Bill Gates, there's all of these same people. They all have the same plan. They all have the same goal. They're all open about it. I mean, I've been studying this stuff just since, 2003. And I've seen nothing but admission and confirmation since 2003 of all this stuff. So to me, it should be obvious. It's not, we shouldn't be debating a quote conspiracy at this point, given the fact that, I've been through 50 public books, not counting, since 2003 studying, analyzing media. So, it's more so, I think at this point, people either want to see it or they don't want to see it, whether it's not a question of fact or not.
Do you have any comments on that, Ashley?
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I see that at the top level, it's really disturbing. From the banking level, I work with a lot of exchanges that are going through getting licensed to be a money transmitter, because you have to if you're exchanging Bitcoin. FinCEN regulates it. The SEC tried to step in, caused a huge mess. Mm-hmm. But right now I've had, and I can talk about this because this is not my client, Chase Bank, but I've had several clients who open accounts with Chase Bank, and these are businesses, and they get the proper licensing in the different states that they're transacting and doing exchange work, and they get registered with FinCEN as an MSB. And then all of a sudden, Chase sends out a notice, your bank account's been closed, and the client will call the bank, and it's the same thing. They say, well, we don't want to service your type of business. Well, Chase Bank right now is in the process of working out their own cryptocurrency and virtual currency. So there are things like that happen. And, people who don't think that these larger corporations have control in various areas. That's why you see all these big buyouts with companies, purchasing other social media companies, and they kind of start to become one big company. Everyone is scratching each other's backs. So yeah, it definitely happens. I see it every day in my line of work.
Yeah, there's a lot of that arena I don't know about, but I'm not surprised. I think that I tend to stay, big picture and look at the overall plans, and it's all very public. If you look at that, we have Reese Committee. I don't know if you guys know about that, but this is a good example of private foundations, private money, and they did a whole, government investigation called the Reese Committee, where they looked into the private tax exempt foundations putting all this money into socially engineering. So this is the universities basically being conditioned to sell people on a lot of leftist socialist type propaganda, not because they believed in principles of socialism or liberalism or whatever, but just to socially engineer, to get people into a collectivist mindset, to turn the public into basically wards of the state. That was basically the whole point of the, just look up the Reese Committee. I mean, this is a famous thing, and it didn't stop just because the government investigated. In fact, most of these things that the government investigates, MK Ultra, they don't stop. They just move on to another kind of program.
Can we get into that a little bit? I was wondering if we can get into some of your MK Ultra research and or similar programs that you've mentioned, because I think these ones are pretty interesting, and you touch on a lot of stuff that a lot of people don't really touch on within MK Ultra and that whole thing. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, this is a whole other fascinating rabbit hole. MK Ultra was dozens of projects with that title. MK Ultra is just one of the sub projects of many of these projects. It began as an Army project to discover truth serum, and so they tried different drugs, and then I think they just kind of stumbled upon the possibility of really potent hallucinogens being used, well, for all kinds of things, right? So they sent a banker, actually Gordon Wasson, down to Latin South America to collect mushrooms because he was a big fanatic for mushrooms. So they got these entheogens and all this stuff, and they basically synthesized it. They had, Abbie Hoffman, these kinds of people who synthesize it. And then they intentionally sort of released it into the subculture, right? So at that time, that would be even in the mid 50s, right? A lot of people don't know that some of the Hollywood stars of the 50s were tripping acid before any of the hippies. So believe it or not, people like Cary Grant was doing acid before any of the Grateful Dead, which is a fascinating story. But that's because in the UK, people like Aldous Huxley, right? He was pioneering doing acid and that kind of stuff in the 30s. And even Crowley could have been a prototype of MK Ultra, because Crowley was doing hardcore drugs even before that, 20s and 30s and stuff. And he was writing these drug diaries, and some people like Dr. Richard Spence, who wrote Secret Agent 666, he speculates that Crowley might have actually been the impetus for MK Ultra via the drug diaries, and that people at the Royal Society, the Huxleys, would have read his drug diaries and said, hey, why don't we study and look into the possibility of controlling the mind with using these chemical, components. And so Tavistock in the UK would delve into that. They were also studying shell shock, which would become PTSD. They pioneered the research in that. At the same time as in the the US Army is beginning to study in the 40s MK Ultra. And so this morphs into a bunch of different projects. As I said, some of the more famous kind of sensational ones would be things like Operation Midnight Climax, where the CIA went to some of their mafia friends, and they said, we want to unwittingly dose the people that come to the whorehouse. And so they were just dosing the Johns coming to the whorehouse. They had no idea what was going on, right? Obviously. And then studying how they reacted to unwittingly being dosed with acid. There were studies where you had, and by the way, we only know some of this. Okay. So a large portion of the MK Ultra documents were destroyed by the CIA director Helms. So we have basically some of the documents, and then we have doctors who were literally MK Ultra doctors who wrote their books. It's kind of amazing that they just wrote these books. So Dr. Jose Delgado has books he's written, Physical Control of the Mind. I've read John C. Lilly's books. He was the creep that was obsessed with dolphins. He would give the dolphins LSD. That was all part of MK Ultra. They called it acid, but it was actually just MK Ultra being, giving LSD to acid. Dr. Jolyon West, who just happens to be the doctor to a lot of the famous terrorists and psychos, Timothy McVeigh. I think he even was Manson's psychologist, which is again itself very weird. Jolyon West was giving LSD to elephants. Delgado pioneered the idea of tying the LSD experiments with animals into the RFID microchips. And then if you read John C. Lilly's autobiography, he claims to be the one who pioneered putting the microchips in the monkeys. So the weird part that most people don't know is that MK Ultra is not so much about programmed assassins and all that. There is a component of that, and the creating alters and trying to program them, and program in Naomi and Monarch. But really, it was about, it morphed into biometrics. So it turns into microchips. It turns into what DARPA does, right? So basically, DARPA is doing what they were really started going for with MK Ultra. But there are these other fascinating stories, like Dr. Estabrooks' famous essay that's still in the DSMB, Hypnosis and the Control of the Mind, where he claims that he could create these alters and program the different alters with trigger words and all this kind of stuff. And then you have a lot of the people who claim to have been abused. I'm not saying they were, I'm not saying they weren't, but people that claim to have been abused and put into these projects. Most famous would be, the first one would be Candy Jones, the famous model from the 50s who was in the USO, right? So the Bob Hope, USO tour. If you look up Candy Jones, she's a fascinating case because she was obviously this beautiful supermodel at the time. And she claims to have been used in this project as a hypnotic courier for the Army. So again, whether that's true or not, we don't know. But Dr. Estabrooks, who is one of the hypnosis MK Ultra doctors, claims that he did this in his famous essay, which you can all this is public. You can go look it up. So anyway, moving on, there's famous cases. If you read Walter Bowart's book on MK Ultra, he talks about the guy who they dosed unwittingly and he jumped out of the window. The guy's name is escaping me. Anyway, but it's a famous.
It reminds me of that movie that's like Manchurian Candidate or something like that.
Yes.
And I think
John Frankenheimer wrote that right around the time that some of the stuff was starting to come out. But what's interesting about his book and the movie is that it's couched in the Cold War, or the beginning of the Cold War, and they make it out like it's the Soviets doing this, when in reality it's the CIA. Multiple governments were doing this. It wasn't just the Soviets, right? So the Soviets had Pavlov and their people doing similar types of human experimentation, but it was the CIA that was really doing this stuff. So it wasn't like, well, oh, we gotta do it. The justification was, well, we gotta do it to fight the Soviets, right? So they just experimented on all these troops and all these people. Violated people's human rights. One of the worst was Dr. Ewan Cameron, right? He would do all of these, basically cut people's parts of their brains out to see what they would do. He would try to do the re-imprinting, the repatterning. If you watch the documentary Minds of Men, it gets pretty deep into Ewan Cameron and how that developed into cybernetics. So actually cybernetics comes out of MK Ultra. A lot of people don't know that, but some of the same people in Dr. Ewan Cameron's circles would end up in MIT circles, and then they would end up in the circles of Norbert Wiener, who's kind of the father of cybernetics. So it's a direct connect from MK Ultra to transhumanism and DARPA and all that. But long story short, yes, basically all the worst things that you can imagine are true.
Wow. And I think you'd mentioned like a Navy program or something that trained.
Yes, there's another program. Now, I don't know for sure if this was part of MK Ultra, but it seems plausible that it would be, because a lot of these programs overlap and they'll just be different names kind of under an overall umbrella. That we don't know the name of that program, but the naval psychologist was Dr. Thomas Nerut, and this is the late 70s. It's mentioned in the New York Times. It's mentioned in this London Telegraph back at the time, and he claimed that the Navy at that time had a program to profile psychopaths, basically inmates and people that were psycho, to put them into a program to see if they could be kind of trained into becoming killers. And he doesn't mention the Phoenix program, but it seems to mirror the Phoenix program, which was the CIA using the Army for creating serial killers, right? Literally creating cannibals and serial killers to use in Vietnam. Famous book, Douglas Valentine, right, wrote his famous books on this. It's admitted program. It really was real. They denied it for a long time, of course, but this is why we have that, pop culture image of the crazy vet, right? The crazy Vietnam vet is because of this, right? It's because of Phoenix Program, MK Ultra. Go watch Lethal Weapon, listen to the Mel Gibson character, Mad Dog, and Danny Glover says, "What's wrong with you? Why are you so crazy?" And Mel Gibson says, it's within the first third of the movie, he's like, "Ever heard of the Phoenix Program?" He's like, "I was in Vietnam. They made me crazy," right? And so, and by the way, Shane Black, who writes a lot of those kind of conspiracy plots, he did that screenplay. He also did Long Kiss Goodnight, which is, right, Gina Davis is a assassin with alternate personalities. So, I can't say to what degree this is all real and fake, but at least we know these programs are real. We know that people were put in these programs. And so some people speculate, to tie this to so-called serial killers, is that many of these serial killers were in the military during the 70s time period. They were in Vietnam, doing Vietnam service. Very likely that they could have been in a program like the Phoenix Program to create cannibals and serial killers. I think that's very plausible.
Now, I think some of the stuff you'd mentioned has to do with military prisons. Was there any cases that you'd come across that were non-military prisons, or that you're aware of?
Well, the rumor is the rumor is that yes, they will try to find people in any case that fit what they were looking for. So it was just easier if you're military to get people out of military prisons. But I would suspect that, for example, some people speculate that Manson was one of these people, and he wasn't in a military prison. But he was in multiple prisons, and he actually went through the ranks of Scientology in prison. So my suspicion is that because of Scientology's connections, they probably spotted him there. And then Manson, I think, appears to be some kind of brainwashed sort of, basically like a contract killer is what I think Manson was.
Now, I want to ask you real quick. I just want to see how are you on time? I have a few more questions, but I want to be respectful. So.
I'm good.
Cool. So, you obviously do a lot of research into like the serial killers, and you just touched on Manson. I was wondering kind of like, what are some of the interesting patterns that we find with all of these different serial killers that you've kind of noticed within research that you find pretty interesting?
Yeah, by the way, I just watched the last of Sons of Sam, the new documentary that's out, and that ends up ironically vindicating most of what Maury Terry had written in his book Ultimate Evil. Of course, that's a kind of a classic in this genre that had speculated and argued pretty forcefully that there's a significant amount of evidence to suggest a larger connection of a kind of uber cult that uses kind of lower level cults for different types of things, organized crime stuff, child prawn, SNUFF films, right? I'm trying to avoid getting anybody in trouble with the algorithms. This kind of really dark stuff that does pop up in a lot of the serial killer cases points to people that connect different cases, right? So for example, in the case of John Wayne Gacy, he for a long time said there were accomplices, and accomplices doesn't obviously just mean people who were with him burying the bodies. Accomplices can be people above them that gave orders or paid for these things to happen. So for a long time, again, a lot of this stuff was called and derided as conspiracy theory, and lo and behold, Tom O'Neill just put out this famous book. He was just on Joe Rogan, Chaos, the Manson in the 60s, CIA Manson in the 60s. Well, it had been a long time speculated that I did a podcast 4 years ago talking about Manson as a CIA connected individual, organized crime connected hit situation. That book backs up a lot of that, right? So this is more and more of this is coming out. This recent Netflix documentary has basically vindicated Maury Terry's book. So we know that there was a higher level cult called the Children, of which Berkowitz was a member, and people in the Children cult, like John Carr, they have direct connect to the Process Church. The Process, he was in the process church. The process directly connects to the Dahmer case via this guy named John Paul Ranieri. The process obviously connects to Manson. I think most people are aware of it now. This is very well known that Manson was influenced by the process church. So yes, so in other words, long story short, is that the real profile of a lot of the serial killer cases is not what the mainstream media has said. The real profile is that they have accomplices. A lot of times they are connected to organized crime and or cults and or satanic cults. They have a association typically with filming it. If you think about David Parker Ray, the toy box killer, if you think about Leonard Lake, Charles Ng, if you think about the Picton Pig Farm, if you think about even Dahmer, a lot of people don't know this, Dahmer had a camera set up inside his apartment filming in. All of these cases, and including Son of Sam, Maury Terry asked Berkowitz if it was an SNUFF operation, and he said yes, it was. And he said that the process church was a front for doing that. Every one of these cases has this come up. Now, does anybody think about that as one of the markers of serial killer cases? No, they don't. It's always a lone, weird creep individual who was, just kept to himself and acted strange and talked to dogs. And he, just wanted to murder prostitutes. That's not even the profile. Like, they don't just murder prostitutes. I mean, in many cases, they murder a lot of different weird types of people, right? So what that suggests is not so much a profile. I mean, some of these people might have a fixation, like John Wayne Gacy obviously wanted to kill gay males, same with Dahmer. But there's more going on here, because in every one of these cases, we find them having military service. Not saying that in every case they were trained by the military to be serial killers, but they're trained by the military, which is, again, an important event in their lives. And many of these, almost all of the serial killers, at least 24 of the serial killers were in the military. I think that's significant, right? And many of them evidence trauma, MPD, DID, which even a lot of psychologists have admitted. So that's the real profile of the serial killer, is that, not what the mainstream media says about just lone, weird white dudes. In fact, there's plenty of female serial killers. There's plenty of serial killers in other races. So it's not just nerdy white guys that are 35 years old and live in an apartment and like to creep on the internet all day. There's all kinds of people that are serial killers. But probably the biggest overlooked thing is the tendency amongst them to have connections to satanic cults, which is way more than most people would think. Son of Sam, Zodiac, Bundy, Dahmer, Manson, Henry Lee Lucas, Richard Ramirez, BTK, David Parker Ray, Herb Baumeister, Ripper Crew, Dutro, the Monster of Florence, Armin Maiweiss, Israel Keys, Adrian Lim. These are just a list. The Ripper Crew, Savile and Sutcliffe, the Order of the Solar Temple, North Fox Island case, the Vampire Sacramento. These are all cases that involve some level of the satanic.
Wow. Yeah, I was going to ask you about the Jack the Ripper. So yeah, it was actually.
I don't know about Jack the Ripper. A lot of people speculate. I think it's likely, but I meant actually the Ripper Crew was a group of guys in Chicago who would get women and basically cut off body parts and eat it. So the Ripper Crew was 4 guys in Chicago.
Okay, I was not familiar.
But most people don't know that. Again, so you've got all these serial killers, and in so many of these cases, they're directly involved in satanic practice, and people don't know this, right?
Ashley, you had something that you wanted to talk about Jack the Ripper? Was that?
Well, Jack the Ripper is tough because at this point, it's still conspiracy. There's not much that they know.
It's so long ago.
It's almost impossible to go back and to really know, because you still have the media back then pushing, different agendas. So
right.
Yeah, there's speculation that the royal family, possibly hired this doctor, but nothing is really set in stone as to who that was. But it could be an example of something like what he.
Did y'all watch the Netflix documentary Sons of Sam?
No.
not.
I mean, this is wild. I mean, it's kind of amazing that they have basically vindicated all the stuff that was in Maury Terry's book. So, I mean, I knew about this. So I read some of this stuff maybe for the first time 10 years ago, right? I'm not like into serial killers, but I in a roundabout way got interested in this by reading about Manson and reading about the CIA, the 60s, counterculture and all that, which, you know, obviously when you get into the Manson stuff, it starts to tick the other boxes of bizarre patterns and connections that come up with people like Mark David Chapman, the John Lennon murder, for example. Why is Mark David Chapman famously giving Kenneth Anger the gift of bullets from the gun that he shot John Lennon with? And if you don't know, Kenneth Anger is, you know, the famous Crowleyan satanic avant-garde filmmaker who made Lucifer Rising, that stars Bobby Beausoleil or Tex Watson, one of the two, from the Manson murders, right? So you've got people direct, and again, in the circles of Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate. Mick Jagger plays, I think, Lucifer in the movie Lucifer Rising. So you've got all these people that are, you know, in cahoots. They're all hanging out. They're all doing the same orgies, the same witchcraft openly. And then come to find out, if you dig deep into the Savile situation, well, the Process Church magazine interviewed Jimmy Savile. They also interviewed Mick Jagger, and Charles Manson wrote an essay for the Process Church magazine. So here we have a connect via, you know, interviews and interest in the part of the Process Church, which most people don't know this, right? You've got again another level of connection between now Savile, right, and groups in the UK doing this stuff.
It's a wild world. You got serial killers, transhumanism coming in. It's wild. And on that, like the transhumanism thing, because it's super relevant. I mean, we were just talking about it. I was wondering if you're aware, there's a writer, I think it's Richard Morgan. He's got a good quote. Let me pull it up real quick. He says, "Society is, always has been, and always will be a structure for the exploitation and oppression of the majority through systems of political force dictated by an elite, enforced by thugs, informed or not, and upheld by a willful ignorance and stupidity on the part of the majority, and the system oppresses." He wrote Altered Carbon. It was turned into a Netflix series.
Yes.
It's one of the best.
Okay.
Have you seen this?
No, I started it and I didn't finish it, but no, I didn't know you said that. That's interesting.
Kind of a plausible dystopian transhumanist type.
Yeah, well, that's
future.
Accurate what he said. that quote's accurate. And
I love this point that I've heard you make. Like, people always make the comment the government is incompetent and they couldn't possibly organize all this stuff, and you're like, yeah, the government doesn't really run things technically. It's like
the
these
public government
tanks.
people are incompetent, but they're just there to sort of be the theater.
Definitely.
But the technocratic elite are not incompetent. They have, 180 IQs. They can build nanobots. They can build supercomputers. They're not incompetent.
Well, the
Well,
think
and
tanks.
go ahead.
Oh, you go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and who do people think funds politicians when they're running up for election? And if people think that politicians just ignore who they're getting funds from, I mean, that's,
Well, yeah. I mean, who do you think has more power? A senator with, that makes $200,000 a year and maybe his, $1 million from his insider trading, or David Rockefeller, who has billions of dollars and, immense power through his foundations.
exactly
Throughout the world. I mean, come on.
if
who
you're
has more
funded
power?
by that, who's going to want to lose that? I mean, so politicians are going to make decisions that are in the favor of those, higher ups that are kind of funding them.
Yeah.
I mean, otherwise they don't
Yeah,
have
they're
the money
just
to stay in
whores for
office.
the billionaires, basically.
Yeah.
So, I mean, is there hope? I mean, it's scary these days because I see all these pieces coming to formations. It's like, that's like that idea of like the prison planet. It seems like it's not outside the realm of possibility. I mean, there's like this enslavement modus operandi, it seems, and like social engineering, indoctrination programs. We got like 5G satellite grid installs going up with Elon, like Lockheed Martin running different aspects. We got smart city development coming in, chip implementation and the normalization of that, like biometric implementation. And it's just crazy. Like, do you see any hope out there? I mean, what's your opinion?
Well, I mean, I have a biblical worldview, so I think that Christ is truth. I think that I'm not saying that I know that for sure that we're in the end times. I don't have any knowledge about that, but if we are in the end times, I'm not worried about it. Yeah, I think that the best explanation for the world just happens to match up to the biblical explanation. The world is fallen; it's ruled over by fallen entities, fallen spirits, and that's why we see so much evil, is that it's demonic. It's beyond just merely human. It's demonic in origin. And the only worldview that really gives a coherent account for that is the biblical worldview. So my best guess for the hope would be that.
Beautiful. And you also believe largely the majority of the UFO phenomena, you basically believe that's a psyop. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. The majority of it is. I think there are obviously unexplained phenomena. I think there is a kind of a dark demonic aspect to it as well. But I think that the most important aspect of it is the fact that it's going to be used as a large-scale deception. Particularly, as I note that, there was a chapter in my book on this. Well, actually, both books have significant sections on the alien deception, but yeah, I think that's going to be used as a social engineering tool to kind of co-opt people just further into global governance and to accepting probably some fake religion or something like that.
Do you have you ever gotten into like the Mellon family of Pittsburgh or anything with any of your research? Like Christopher Mellon, he's like his involvement with like TTSA and the whole disclosure deal. I don't know.
I mean, is he part of Carnegie Mellon family, or is this a different Mellon family?
I believe so. And then there's I think it's maybe Tom Mellon. He was like one of the early bankers at the end of like the 19th century. And
that would be the Carnegie Mellon family. Okay. No, I didn't know that they have a connection to disclosure, but I'm not surprised there. That's interesting.
Yeah, interesting. One thing I wanted to ask you about was something called, I think it was called the Committee of 300. Is that a legit thing? What is that all about? Do you know?
I think that John Coleman had some things right. I'm not going to say that he was totally wrong. I mean, he did write a lot about Tavistock, but Coleman said a lot of things about Tavistock that can't be verified. So I don't know how much he was speculating. Like he said that Tavistock created the Beatles. I've never seen anybody actually prove that it's possible, but I don't know that there's just one set group of 300 people that kind of rule everything. But there's probably something like that.
There's this group I've been mentioned to me a few times called the Council for National Policy, and I don't know if you're familiar with that. If it's a good
I
thing
am.
or a
I mean,
bad
people
thing.
think this is like, so there's the CFR, which is the left side of the paradigm, and there's the CNP, which is this more neocon, so-called right-wing side of the global planning structure. I think that the CNP is definitely an arm of this whole pyramid. And there are kind of so-called right-wing people at the top, and there are so-called left-wing people at the top, but it's all the same plan. So, I mean, I don't think that when we look at the world, it's right-wingers that are taking over and implementing the things that we see on a daily basis.
Definitely.
It's technocrats who are not right-wing or left-wing. They don't care about any of that stuff.
Right. It's all a game. Is there anything important or interesting you want to throw out there before I want to tell people first about your books as well, and then where they can find those. So maybe if you want to touch on that.
Yeah, if you want to get the books, they're both on movies and film analysis and the history of Hollywood and cults and mobs and all that stuff, how it relates to movies. And you can get that at the website in the shop. If you get it from the website, you get signed copies. Everybody gets a signed copy. So don't give Jeff Bezos your money. So get it from me. And then if you are interested in my material at the website, I have kind of about 5 years archived of interviews, lectures, podcasts, talks, all kinds of stuff there on a variety of topics. We do movie analyses. We do debates, as you said. We do all kinds of stuff. We did a TV show, full production TV show a couple of years ago called Hollywood Decoded, which is, I don't own that. That's at Gaia TV. We did I'm on Rockfin now, so you can get a lot of exclusive content over on Rockfin. And then on YouTube, I'm just Jay Dyer. You can find me.
Awesome. Okay, one more question. Because this is something I want to ask you too. You've gone really deep, like, and you've interviewed a number of folks like in the intelligence agencies and MI5, Pentagon, Black Ops, and all of that. And I wondered, just for a last question, like, what are some of the most insightful or like illuminating interviews that you've done that you would recommend that kind of sheds light on some really interesting aspects that you would kind of point people to, or you think might be really very interesting?
Probably the biggest was when we did Alex Jones interview. Well, Alex Jones had me on a special Saturday show maybe about a month ago, and that got about 1.5 million views. So that was probably the biggest interview. But that was just me. So I'm trying to think of, we were talking about Jonas Salk and mRNA and all that stuff. Let's see, let me think. Most insightful interviews over the years. I'm going to be interviewing Sean Atwood this Sunday, and he's a pretty well-known kind of true crime podcaster. He's got a huge YouTube channel that does true crime, and he's got a really fascinating story about the connections between intelligence agencies and the mafia and organized crime. And he was kind of running a big ecstasy ring back in the 90s before he went to jail, and then after jail, he came out, wrote books, became a podcaster. So we've had some really cool interviews and chats, and I'm looking forward to that interview this weekend. But yeah, I'm sorry, I'd have to think for a minute about the insightful interviews.
Or any people.
It was cool to talk to Brian Callen. I mean, watched his comedy and stuff for a long time, so I didn't expect that.
Such a great interview.
This sounds kind of arrogant. I'm just trying. I have to think. I mean, yeah. So it was cool to interview Annie Michonne long time ago. She was the British intelligence person, whistleblower, and then Colonel Anthony. I forgot. I just went blank on his name, but he's the former Black Ops guy. I forget his name. But those were some. Yeah, I actually forgot about those. Those are like 10 years ago now. But I don't know, man. I'm sorry. I'm not coming up with good interviews, right? But
okay. You've only done like
more recently the debates, right? So we've had some pretty big debates the last few years.
Awesome. Ashley, any last questions or thoughts or comments?
I'm going to ask
Nothing I
you.
can think of. Thank you for having me. Really cool. Anything else you guys want to bring up?
I'm going to ask you one question.
Sure.
So when you pass away, what's the one thing that you want to be most remembered by that you did? Tough question.
Well, hopefully that I, was able to promote Orthodox Christianity. So I'm Eastern Orthodox, so hopefully that can be at the top there.
Fair enough. All right.
Well, Jay, you're the man. Thank you so much. I really appreciated this. Had a great time.
Yeah, man. Thank you. It was great to talk to both you guys. It was a great interview.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Philosophical Minds podcast. If you've enjoyed any of the content that you've heard today, I'd like to support the show. You can do so over at paypal.me/philosophicalminds. That is paypal.me/philosophicalminds.